we're going to get started here. It's my great honor to introduce Shaul Magid. Rivel and Krell was going to take the introduction. Unfortunately, health reasons have kept her away today from the conference. I know she very much wanted to make some comments and introduction. So some of the things what I'm going to say is based on some of the notes which she kindly sent me about Shaul, and then maybe I'll make a few comments of my own. So Shaul Magid has just joined the faculty of Dartmouth College as a distinguished fellow after many years as the J. and G. Schottenstein Professor of Jewish Studies at Indiana University. He's a scholar of remarkable range and productivity. He's renowned for his work on Hasidic thought. His books, and there's a very long list of publications. His books include Hasidism, The Margin, Hasidism Incarnate, Hasidism, Christianity, The Making of Modern Judaism and Piety, Rebellion. In a forthcoming book, the Bible, the Talmud, and the New Testament, Elijah Soloveitchik's commentary for the Gospel. He has also published works on Lurianic mysticism. His book, From Metaphysics to Midrash, was awarded the 2008 American Academy of Religion Award for Best Book in Religion in the Textual Studies category in 2008. He has a book forthcoming on somewhat of a different subject, Meir Kahana, The Rise and Fall of an American Jewish Survivalist, which promises to be an equally exciting book with this difficult, helping a unique observation. And here we've been talking a lot about the union in this building. This I can't resist. Shaul, you may be aware of this. But in this very building where we are sitting today, the Union, the Hoffman Union, about 1 week before Meir Kahana's assassination, he gave a speech in the Kaufman Union. There were all kinds of people, protesters who were taken from the stage, Arab students, whatever, wearing keffiyehs and so on. So it was a whole, quite an interesting scene. So I couldn't resist but to say that of the perhaps adding a little bit to the notoriety of the and maybe some of the ironies of the building that we've been meeting for this conference. In addition to this work, and I'll continue, forgive me for the digression, but I couldn't resist that one. So in addition to his work, Shaul is a public intellectual, publishing widely in the Jewish world, in print and digital media, and commenting, educating, and reflecting on diverse matters, including Israel, American Jewry, Hasidism, religion, and much more. It is my pleasure, therefore, to welcome Shaul, University of Minnesota, for his keynote address, The Anxious Hyphen in Judaism and Christianity, Elijah Soloveitchik, and Oswald Rufeisen.
Thank you all for staying to the bitter end, and for Leslie, and Daniel, and Natan, and everybody who was involved in inviting me and organizing the conference. I'm very happy to be here. I've met some people who I've never met before, but whose work I've read, and that's always, as an academic, that's always a pleasure to really actually get to engage with people who then you've gotten inside their minds in terms of their writing, but haven't really had a chance to converse with them. So that's one of the great pleasures of these kinds of conferences. Actually, just before I start, this book I'm finishing with Kahane, he spoke at the University of Minnesota, and then from there he actually went to Brandeis University, where I was a graduate student, I think a day later, and then 2 days later he went back to New York, and then he was killed, I think, a day later. So, anyway, that is a different story entirely, a different kind of hyphen. Daniel Boyarin begins his book, The Jewish Gospel, with the following statement. If there's one thing that Christians know about their religion, it is that it's not Judaism. And if there's one thing that Jews know about their religion, it is that it's not Christianity. This admittedly simple assertion holds more truth than one might think. This is not to say that the claim of categorical difference is correct. Rather, it has become deeply embedded in Christian perceptions of Judaism and Jewish perceptions of Christianity, an integral part of each one's own self-fashioning. The hyphen, as we know, it both separates and connects, producing an anxiety of identity and a liquidity of boundaries. While Jews have been hyphenated in many ways, as we witnessed during the last few days, the hyphen that stands between, both separating and connecting Judaism and Christianity, is perhaps one of the longest standing and most perplexing. While the historical record shows a much more complex and messy reality between Judaism and Christianity, and Jew and Christian, the investment in categorical distinctions on both sides for different reasons remains operative, or even precisely in our increasingly post-supersessionist world. The attitude of irreconcilability from the Jewish side that Boyarin expresses is perhaps most succinctly captured in two comments. The first one by Justice Moshe Silberg of the Israeli Supreme Court in his decision in the Brother Daniel case in Israel, and Oswald Rufeisen is Brother Daniel, as we'll soon see. A landmark case on the question of who is a Jew, 1961. Brother Daniel, or Oswald Rufeisen, as we'll discuss below, was a Jew from Poland who became a Carmelite monk during the war, and in 1958 attempted to immigrate to Israel under the law of return, a law stating that any Jew could automatically become a citizen of the state. In his decision rejecting Oswald's request, Silberg wrote, and I quote, "The basic concept is that Jew and Christian are two titles that cannot be combined in one subject." End quote. The second statement is by the Jewish political philosopher Leo Strauss, who wrote, and I quote, "There is no reconciliation between Judaism and Christianity. Judaism is the anti-Christian principle, pure and simple." End quote. While similar, Silberg and Strauss are actually making two very different claims. Strauss's claim has to do with two religions and their irreconcilability. Silberg is asking about Jew and Christian. Can a Jew also be a Christian? Or can a Christian be a Jew? That is, can Judaism and Christianity exist in a single subject without a hyphen? So this afternoon I want to examine the lives of two Jews, both of whom held deep respect for Christianity as well as Judaism, but who took very different paths. The first, Oswald Rufeisen, converted to Christianity, subsequently becoming a monk, and the other, Elias Soloveitchik, remained an ultra-Orthodox Jew, yet held a deep love and respect for Christianity as expressed in his Hebrew commentary to Mark, Matthew, and Luke, arguing that the simultaneous truth, even identity, between both religions exists. Rufeisen and Soloveitchik stand on opposite sides of the conversion spectrum, and each retained a deep and unbending love for Judaism and identified as Jews throughout their lives. Each in different ways reject the hyphen as a mark of separation, resisting Boyarin's comment above, still on the screen. My claim is that Rufeisen and Soloveitchik represent two examples where the categorical distinction between Judaism and Christianity and Jew and Christian, articulated by Silberg and Strauss, is problematized. I think the differences between Soloveitchik and Rufeisen in regards to their views of Christianity and Judaism and conversion, Soloveitchik never converted, Rufeisen did, also illustrate a perspective worth considering in contesting Silber and Strauss's assertions that, as Boyarin suggests, holds popular appeal. As we'll see, Soloveitchik holds Judaism and Christianity are basically symmetrical, and attenuating the hyphen as a marker of separation, thus attenuating the hyphen as a marker of separation. For that very reason, for Soloveitchik, because Judaism and Christianity are basically symmetrical, there is no reason to convert. A Jew can remain a Jew and a Christian can remain a Christian precisely because the religions they practice are not in conflict. Rufeisen does not hold that Judaism and Christianity are the same. It's precisely for this reason that he does convert. He finds something in Christianity that answered his need to understand his experience in the Holocaust that he could not find in Judaism. But Rufeisen is claiming that being a Christian does not preclude being a Jew. For him, it's precisely because Judaism and Christianity are different that one can be both. The former does not erase the latter. As we'll see, Rufeisen was a secular Zionist and remained so his entire life, even after his conversion to Catholicism. His Jewishness was not forged through religion, but an ethnic identity with the Jewish people. When he finds religion in Christianity, he does not view that as a repudiation of his Jewishness, precisely because his Jewishness was not founded on religion to begin with. Later in life, when he moves to the Stella Maris Carmelite Monastery in Haifa, he becomes part of a Hebrew Christian community that sought to revive an earlier form of Christianity with its roots deeply in Judaism. So, to Soloveitchik. Eliza Zvi Soloveitchik was born probably in Slutsky, Russia in 1805 and died in London in 1881. He was the grandson of Chaim ben Isaac of Volozhin, the founder of the Volozhin Yeshiva in the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth and author of the celebrated Nefesh HaChaim, which you see above. Elijah Zvi was an early member of the Soloveitchik rabbinic dynasty. He was educated in the Volozhin Yeshiva, which was the most prestigious Jewish institute of higher learning in the 19th century. Later in life, Elijah Zvi lived mostly as an itinerant, traveling between Lithuania, Russia, Germany, Poland, France, and then finally England. His most popular book, Kol Koreh, which you see above, is a Hebrew rabbinic commentary to the synoptic Gospels of Mark, Matthew, and Luke. It was written over the course of about a decade and published in multiple languages. Kol Koreh's distinction is that it is a New Testament commentary written in Hebrew by a rabbinic scholar in the 19th century who believed that he could prove through the use of classical rabbinic sources that Judaism and Christianity do not stand in contradiction to one another. This is the first 1870 Paris edition. The only copy that I was able to find was in the National Library in Jerusalem. The Alliance Israelite in Paris said they had a copy, but they couldn't find it. But apparently the National Library had made a copy of the original Alliance copy. And it was actually reprinted in 1985 by a Protestant seminary in Jerusalem. I can talk later about the story of the history of the publication of the book. It's been noted that Soloveitchik was the first modern Jew to write an actual verse-by-verse commentary in Hebrew to the New Testament. Most other works at that time were written either by Jewish converts to Christianity or by rabbinic figures who polemicized against Christianity, but they weren't writing commentaries. There's very little known about Soloveitchik's life. Sometime in the 1830s or 1840s, he began to exhibit an interest in Christianity and began a lifelong project of composing a Hebrew commentary to the Gospels. Unlike most other Jews at his time, he didn't convert, who had an interest in Christianity. He doesn't convert, nor ever considered converting. In the period, and of course, this is a picture of him on the left here, on your left. In the early period of his publishing career, Soloveitchik practices of translation focused primarily on Moses Maimonides. In 1846, he publishes a German translation of his edition of a collection of Maimonides' Book of Knowledge in Königsberg, And in his commentary on Maimonides' 13 Principles of Faith, Soloveitchik, writing in a Christian voice, or perhaps this is the voice of the translator, states that the misunderstanding of Jews and Christians has three components. Number one, our Jewish brethren have no faith, and that the summit of the Christian belief centers on the eradication of the laws of Moses. Number two, that we Christians, and again, I think he's speaking in a Christian voice, that we Christians are their opponents and merely seek their subversion. And number three, that the generality of Jews as well as Christians, being unacquainted with that which constitutes Judaism of the present, that is rabbinic tradition, looks upon the chasm and separates Judaism from Christianity to be of such great magnitude as to render all efforts of reconciliation in vain. The second edition includes a letter addressed to, quote, my Christian brethren, in Soloveitchik's own voice that begins with the following quote, I much regret to find that there exists amongst you a deeply rooted aversion to the sayings of the Talmud. Soloveitchik was a harmonizer, and in a sense a throwback, as it were, to pre-modern renderings in the New Testament. His Lithuanian Talmudic training resulted in him reading the New Testament in the way a Tosafos, the medieval glossators to the Babylonian Talmud, would read a Talmudic text, noticing contradictions in the text or its commentaries, and using other texts to resolve the discrepancy. Soloveitchik often notes an apparent contradiction in the text or perception, looks for a precedent in Talmudic literature to debunk that claim, that he then reads into the text, into the gospel, to resolve a misunderstanding. As much as his readings of the text are stripped of an entire history of Christian exegesis, his commentary often offers glimpses into how these texts can be understood apart from the context of their later interpretation in relation to Christian anti-Judaism. In some ways, Soloveitchik stands on the hyphen and suggests that it should be recalibrated as a mark that links two distinct but largely symmetrical renderings of a single Judaic tradition, Judaism and Christianity. One of the more vexing dimensions of the Synoptic Gospels is the question of Jesus' claim to be Messiah, or whether others considered him to be so. In addition, one of the dominant themes of Jewish criticism of the Gospels is that such a claim is within Jewish thinking impossible for a variety of reasons. On this question, the legal code of Maimonides is often evoked. In his Law of Kings, Maimonides delineates the criteria of the messianic vocation. On Maimonides' criteria, Jesus as the true Messiah is simply impossible. What then do Jews make of this claim of Christianity? One common trope was that Jesus was a false Messiah, a category that has precedent in Jewish literature both before and after Jesus. Soloveitchik takes a different tack in his assessment of Jesus' messianic vocation. Rather than denying Jesus Messiah, something difficult to do given the plethora of references to his messianic vocation, or making a distinction between a false or a failed Messiah, or a Joseph or Davidic Messiah, Soloveitchik claims that the central vocation of the Messiah is to teach people the fundamental lesson of Judaism, which is the unity of the Creator. Thus, in almost every reference to the Messiah in Mark and Matthew, Soloveitchik comments about Jesus' success in spreading the true gospel, that is, the unity of God. For Soloveitchik's perspective, this is accomplished by Jesus in a particularly successful way, both to his Jewish compatriots and later to the Gentiles like Paul. This notion of divine unity is the centerpiece of Maimonides' depiction of monotheism. So he gives us a kind of Maimonidean Jesus. What was the social context of this work? The middle decades of the 19th century were both incredibly fertile and precarious decades for the Jews of Eastern Europe, both those who remained there and for those who immigrated to the West, yet remained attached to the ways of their Eastern European ancestors. The Haskalah, or Jewish Enlightenment, that had blossomed in Berlin in a circle around Moses Maimonides, Moses Mendelssohn, a few generations earlier, had now made its way deep into the recesses of the Pale of Settlement in Poland and in the Austro-Hungarian Empire, where most Jews lived. Alexander II's emancipation of the serfs in 1861 as part of a larger project of reforms enabled Jews to be more integrated into the empire. More important for our purpose was the reign of Alexander I during the Napoleonic period. As Israel Bartal argues, Alexander I's spiritual, even mystical nature and traditional inclination was viewed positively by many leading rabbinic figures of the period. Alexander's spirituality was also resulted in the initiation of a concerted effort to convert the Jews of Russia to Christianity, what Alexander firmly believed was the true spiritual legacy of the Russian Empire. In addition, in 1917, Alexander established the Society of Israelite Christians, whose purpose was to support converts and serve as resource for Jews interested in converting to Christianity. Given that this story predates Soloveitchik a little bit, for our purposes, there are other important features that will play a role as we move more deeply into the 19th century. The first is the introduction of the London Society for Promoting Christianity Among the Jews to Eastern Europe. This Protestant missionary organization based in England was active in the empire for much of the 19th century, often using Jewish converts to Christianity such as Nehemiah Solomon and Stanislav Hoga, who was himself a fascinating figure, as translators and emissaries to approach Jewish communities and teach them about conversion. This resulted in the appearance of the first Yiddish translation of the New Testament, probably translated by Solomon and published in 1821. As Jews were experiencing a loosening of restrictness in Russia and Poland during the Napoleonic period and emancipation was slowly exposing Jews to the wider world, the program of converting the Jews, not necessarily as an act of malice, but ostensibly as an act of inclusion, became a serious issue for Jewish communities. The role of conversion in Soloveitchik's project is conspicuous in its absence. It seems clear, however, that as part of the Lithuanian ultra-Orthodox society, he seemed to be a man for whom religious conviction mattered above all else. While we can never know how he felt about conversion, his commentary certainly does not address the audience of the conversions of convenience, which Todd Enderman basically says most of the converts to Christianity, most of the Jewish converts to Christianity in the 19th century were conversions of convenience and not conversions of conviction, meaning people that converted simply because it was easier for them as Christians to be able to function in the world, not because they necessarily believed in Christianity. As we will see, Oswald Rufeisen was one of those kinds of converts of conviction, not converts of convenience, albeit one who had a particular rendering of his Jewishness and his conversion that had legal ramifications in Israeli law. And Rufeisen, as opposed to many others who retained some sense of his Jewishness, made the case that one could be both a national Jew and a religious Christian. The question of conversion, while never directly engaged by Soloveitchik, may loom large as the backdrop of his commentary. During the decade when Soloveitchik was completing his commentary, the work of the London Society for the Promotion of Christianity to the Jews continued and became more popular and arguably more effectual through the work of an important missionary whose name was Alexander McCall. Oh, there it is. Yeah. Alexander McCall. McCall was a professor, there he is. McCall was a professor of Hebrew and rabbinic literature at King's College, London, and was offered to be the bishop in Jerusalem in 1841. He is a fascinating and important figure of the 19th century who published numerous works relating to Judaism and Christianity. One of the most popular, and for our purposes most important work, is something called the Old Paths, or the Talmud tested by Scripture, being a comparison of the principles and doctrines of modern Judaism with the religion of Moses. In those days, they didn't care about titles, obviously. That's the title of the book. It was published in London in 1836. McCall was quite learned in rabbinic literature, was fluent in its requisite languages, spent considerable time in Palestine, and also lived for a few years in Poland among Jews, where he mastered classical Hebrew and Aramaic, and also learned fluent Yiddish. Even as a missionary, he was quite a philo-Semite. Just to give two examples, he strongly defended the Jews in the 1840 Damascus blood libel, organizing a document signed by 57 Jewish converts to Christianity to say that Jews never use Christian blood for any ritual purpose. He also criticized Napoleon's brother James's handling of the Jews of France. He was clearly not typical of the missionaries of that period. But the Old Paths is an exhaustive work that cites copiously from the body of rabbinic literature to argue that the rabbinic sages erred in their interpretation of the Hebrew Bible, and thus modern Judaism as an heir to the rabbis is mistaken. McCall was unlike other missionaries in that he had a deep and abiding respect for both Jews and Judaism. He even received accolades from prominent Jews such as the important historian Isaac Marcus Jost, and others as well. The Old Paths was quite popular during Soloveitchik's lifetime. While it may be unlikely that Soloveitchik read McCall's Old Paths in the original, which was in English, as we don't know that Soloveitchik really had much of a command of English, it is more likely that he knew it from a Hebrew translation called the Tivot Shalom, which was translated by a Jewish apostate and member of the London Society, Stanislaus Hoga. Hoga, who died in 1860, is another fascinating personality of this period, who has recently been examined by David Ruderman. If Ruderman is correct, that Hoga, in a sense, converted and then worked for McCall and then became a Jew once again, but it's not clear if he ever reverted back to Judaism, he would represent one who embodies what Ruderman calls a mingled identity, what we might call as bringing the hyphen back to life, both Jew and Christian, or perhaps neither Jew nor Christian. The Hebrew Christian identity, as we will see Rufeisen owns as well, fits nicely with the oblique remark that Hoga makes in a book that he wrote called The Controversy of Zion. Hoga says, "It is vain to think of the conversion of the Jews to Christianity before Christians themselves are converted to Judaism." Here I think we can see how close Hoga comes to Soloveitchik, albeit from the opposite end of the conversion divide. And also, he's not far from Rufeisen in that for Hoga, his conversion did not erase his Jewish identity. My reading of Soloveitchik is that Jews need not convert to Christianity because all that is true in Christianity is part of Judaism. And Christians need not try to convert the Jews for the very same reason. And for Rufeisen, Judaism and Christianity are not identical, which makes conversion an option, but that act does not preclude being both at the same time precisely because they are different aspects of one's own identity. The final theme I want to examine regarding Soloveitchik before turning to Rufeisen is something less endemic to his commentary and more to the context of the project more generally. Earlier I provided a compass to illustrate the ways in which his work may have been a response to the anti-Talmudic missionizing activity in the mid to late 19th century. The reason I say compass is that Soloveitchik never discusses the missionizing phenomenon. He never discusses McCall. He never discusses conversion, at least not in writing. And thus, even though I think he was probably aware of the Tivot Shalom, his intentions in regard to his commentary as a response to it must remain conjecture. In terms of rising instances of anti-Semitism, however, Soloveitchik does state openly that he believes that his work will help solve the age-old problem, founded in his view on Christianity's misunderstanding of Judaism. He was obviously not typical of his milieu. He was an outlier in his community, mostly ignored by his rabbinic colleagues, largely written out of the history of the Soloveitchik dynasty, and his commentary was likely read more by Christians than Jews. I can tell you afterwards how I discovered a copy of the 1985 reprint in a Christian mission in Arizona. And yet he exhibits a sentiment that, while uncommon in his time, was not unprecedented in earlier historical periods. Let's turn to Oswald Rufeisen. He was born in 1922 in a small town in the southern tip of Poland. In many ways, he was a typical Polish Jew of that period, unlike Soloveitchik, who came from a rabbinic dynasty in Jewish Lithuania. Oswald's parents weren't particularly religious, but they likely kept a kosher home, according to him. Later in life, Rufeisen reflects that, he says, quote, "As a child, I wanted to know about the truth. I was not a pious Jew, but I felt deeply religious." In any case, the young Rufeisen's Jewishness was not driven by religion, but by Zionism. There is at least one difference between Rufeisen's home and those of his Jewish neighbors in Poland, a difference that eventually would save his life. The Rufeisens spoke German and not Yiddish at home. In fact, Rufeisen claims that he never knew Yiddish. He studied in a Jewish school where the instruction was in German, and later in a Polish state school where the instruction was in Polish. His fluency in both languages and his knowledge of Polish history would later enable him to disguise himself as a Polish national and serve as a German-Polish translator for the Nazi police. Most of Rufeisen's Jewish identity was expressed through Zionism. As an adolescent, he belonged to the Zionist youth group Akiva that was active in the region of Poland and established a kind of urban kibbutz for adolescents intending to immigrate to Palestine. He and his brother Aryeh, who eventually did immigrate to Palestine before the war, were active members, and Rufeisen eventually hid in various locales with members of the group after the German invasion of Poland. The story of Rufeisen's wanderings during the war, documented in the Nehama Tech's excellent 1990 book called In the Lion's Den, The Life of Oswald Rufeisen, but for our limited purposes, what is necessary to know is that Rufeisen saved himself by working as a translator, eventually becoming a member of the Nazi police force in Russia, in order to save himself from almost certain death at the hand of the Nazis. During that time, he had access to Nazi plans for the liquidation of various Jewish villages and towns, and working with Jewish informants and in some cases partisan fighters living in the forest, Rufeisen was able to convey the Nazi plans to Jews in advance of these raids on many occasions. Some villagers didn't believe the reports and remained and were subsequently murdered, but many took the advance notice and fled. It was hard to know how many thousands of lives Rufeisen saved in those years, but after he immigrated to Israel and lived in the Stella Maris monastery in Haifa, he was often visited by Jews whose lives he saved, who referred to him as their savior and treated him like a hero. He was then, of course, a Carmelite monk. In the early 1940s, Rufeisen was working as a translator for someone named Meister Reinhold Hein, the head of a police battalion in charge of that area that included the small city of Mir. That's the Mir ghetto. He took a liking to Rufeisen and treated him like a son, and he never suspected that Rufeisen was a Jew. The Nazis planned to liquidate the Mir ghetto on August 11, 1942. Rufeisen knew of the plan and sent word to the ghetto for the Jews to flee, which was quite easy at that time. In fact, Rufeisen visited the ghetto at night numerous times to meet with the Judenrat and some of the rebels, trying to convince them that the Nazis' communications that the ghetto would be spared were false. He even organized getting weapons stolen from the Nazis to the ghetto to help with the escape. On August 11, 1942, the Nazis discovered that over 300 Jews had escaped from the ghetto. This was not the first time such a thing had happened in the area, but this time it was very embarrassing for Hein, and he needed to get to the bottom in order to protect his own skin. So Hein calls Rufeisen into his office. Rufeisen was concerned and thought that a Jew named Stanislavski, who worked in the stable near the police station, may have turned him in. Hein sat him down and said, "Oswald, you are being suspected of treason. Is it true that you told the Jews of the action?" Rufeisen responded, "Yes, Herr Meister, it is true." And Hein responded, "Stupid. Why did you admit it? I would have believed you rather than this Jew Stanislavski." Obviously, Stanislavski was the one who turned him in. When pressed why he did it, Rufeisen responded, "I did it out of pity. I felt sorry for them." Even then, Hein had apparently not suspected Rufeisen was a Jew. After further admissions that Rufeisen had provided weapons for the Mir Jews, Hein said, "I came to the conclusion," he's saying to Rufeisen, "I came to the conclusion that as a Polish nationalist, you took revenge for what we Germans did to the Poles. It was a Pole acting against the Germans, an act of revenge. Am I right? I want to hear it from you." Hein was giving Rufeisen an out. According to Rufeisen, Hein was a decent man, and he often felt the Germans were treating the Jews, the Poles, poorly. He also did not seem to hate Jews like many others in the force. He was doing what he was charged to do. It seems that after all these months in hiding, or hiding his identity, the pressure was getting to Rufeisen, and he appeared to have reached his limit. So Rufeisen responds to Hein, "No, you are not right. I will tell you the truth on the condition that you give me a gun so that I can shoot myself." And Hein says, "All right, we'll see, just tell me." And so Rufeisen says, "So I will tell you, Herr Meister, I am not a Pole, I am a Jew." Hein was stunned and hurt. He had real affection for Rufeisen and felt personally distraught by this admission. Rufeisen begged Hein for the gun to kill himself rather than to be shot by the Nazis, but Hein refused and said to him, "There is no need for that. You succeeded twice, you may succeed a third time." Hein wrote the report on Rufeisen, but he was not immediately arrested. Hein seemed to be to intentionally protract the case to give Rufeisen a chance to escape. That evening after dinner, Rufeisen stepped out of the police dining hall, saw that no one was following him. Thinking quickly, he escaped into an open field. He took advantage of the opportunity Hyphen gave him, but he knew the next day a search party would try to track him down. So he wanders around in the forest for a few days, and he found refuge among some of the peasants in the area, but found no safe haven. And on August 16, 1942, Rufeisen knocked on the door of the convent that belonged to the Order of the Sisters of Resurrection, right next to the Mir Ghetto. The Mother Superior who opened the door recognized him and let him in, and Rufeisen wasn't initially seeking refuge, and he certainly had no pretensions of converting at that time, but he wanted to know if the Mother Superior had contact information for the Baliki sisters, friends of his from Mir, who he thought could help him find more permanent refuge. Mother Superior let him in and gave him a place to sleep in the hayloft of the barn until she decided what to do with him. The nuns were divided whether to let him stay or to send him away, but the Mother Superior vetoed all naysayers and demanded that he stay under the protection of the convent. He was now able to relax and not be on the run for a little while, and during this time he made use of his convent library and read voraciously both Hebrew books he found in the attic of the library and also the New Testament. His reflections on this time are relevant. In an interview with Nechama Tech, he recounted that he came across the miracles reported at Lourdes, and this ignited his interest in Christianity. And so, after I read these miraculous cures, hearing a sermon about the Good Samaritan and the 10 following me with his own reading, I asked for a New Testament and began to study it. I felt very much like a Jew. I identified with the plight of my people. I also felt like a Zionist. I longed for Palestine, for my own country. In this frame of mind, I became exposed to the New Testament, a book that described events that were taking place in my fatherland, the land I was longing for. This itself must have created a psychological bridge between me and the New Testament. Strange as it may seem, I had a Polish high school diploma, but I never read the New Testament. No one demanded it of me. About the church, I knew only negative things. I was prejudiced against the church. What is salient here is his interest in the gospel was driven by his longing for the land of Israel. In the solitude of a convent while Nazi onslaught burns his people outside, as an escape, Rufeisen entered a fantastical state of a distant past in the land of Israel. In the convent, all alone among strangers, I created an artificial world for myself. I pretended that the 2,000 years never happened. In this make-believe world of mine, I am confronted with Jesus of Nazareth. You must realize that not all history about Jesus is the history of the church. The history of Jesus is a fragment of Jewish history. So I began to learn more and more toward the position taken by Jesus. I found myself agreeing with Jesus' approach and view of Judaism. In this process, I somehow disregard all that happened later in the relationship between Jews and Christians. Distinguishing between Jesus and the church is, of course, a long debated issue among Jews who came to discover the historical Jesus. In fact, it embodies the off-cited quip among Jews that Judaism is the religion of Jesus and Christianity is the religion about Jesus. Interestingly, living in a convent hiding from the Nazis as a Jew, Rufeisen can imagine the Jesus movement of Christianity before the church, and it is Jesus whose teachings most resonate with his present circumstances. Suddenly, I don't know how, I identify his suffering and resurrection with the suffering of my people and the hope for their resurrection. I begin to think that if a man who is just and pure dies not for his sins but because of his circumstances, there must be a God because it is God who brings him back to life. I think that if there is justice toward Christ in the form of resurrection, here will be some kind of justice toward my people too. Here Rufeisen gets to the root of his conversion. As a translator for the Nazis, he witnessed firsthand the utter brutality of one human against another. In a 1984 interview, Rufeisen noted that on 3 occasions he translated execution orders from German to Polish and had to witness the murder of his fellow Jews. He saw firsthand countless innocent Jewish souls go to their deaths for no other reason than they were Jews. Understandably, this evoked a sense of deep ambivalence, not only in God, but in humanity. The innocent death and subsequent resurrection of Jesus resonated with him as a model of how he viewed his people in the Holocaust. It is no accident for that Zionists refer to Israel as the Tukuma, the resurrection, also translated as rebirth. but certainly can be resurrection, of a broken people from the jaws of annihilation. One can hear in Rufeisen's testimony the verbal articulation of Marc Chagall's crucifixion paintings. The series of paintings of a man in talit and tefillin hanging on the cross was Chagall's rendering of the crucifixion of Eastern European Jewry. The Jews were the Jesus figure and the Christians were the Roman executioners. When Nechama Tech asked Rufeisen, symbolically, you see the Holocaust as another crucifixion? Rufeisen responded, yes, of course. For me, the Holocaust is the Golgotha of the Jews, a road to redemption. Rufeisen was unwilling to fuse the church with Jesus' teachings, which of course would make him somewhat of an outcast in the church as well. He resonates with many Jews who discovered the historical Jesus, and Soloveitchik as well, when he said as follows: Christ's teachings are basically Jewish, not Roman, not Greek, not Polish. The New Testament is Jewish, written by Jews for Jews. Just because at this moment the inheritors, the administrators of the Testament are not Jews, does not mean that I have to remove myself from it. On the contrary, I should bring back into the New Testament the Jewish elements, myself being one of those Jewish elements, and others like me. There are many people like me, Christians who say I should be me. There are many people like me, Christians who see themselves as Jews. Here, Rufeisen is not far from Soloveitchik, except Soloveitchik tried to bridge the gap through rabbinic commentary, whereas Rufeisen, not adept in Talmudic learning, does it through his personal choice to adopt Christianity and remain a Jew, and make a public statement to affirm that claim. Rufeisen's attempt to circumvent the historical church is certainly contestable, especially since he joins a medieval monastic order, but his point is one that Soloveitchik alludes to as well, that rabbinic literature can help us recreate the Jesus movement before it became mired in church politics and theology. Rufeisen's honesty seems to have been emboldened by his conversion. Remember, he spent most of the war hiding his identity. Now he flaunted it, even precisely because that identity was so audacious. Christianity seemed to make him a Jewish believer, and that he found something that made sense to him as an interpretive lens to understand the reality in which he lived. I'm quoting here, "In Jesus I found an answer to the Holocaust which I could not find in Judaism. In Jesus I see a crucified Jew who through his crucifixion offers redemption." More a survivor than a leader, Rufeisen had finally found a cause to make the claim that one can be both a Jew and a Christian. This cause would instigate a landmark decision in the Jewish world. In 1945, Rufeisen arrived in Krakow with a letter of introduction to Father Josef Prus, the Provençal of the Carmelite order in Poland. He wanted to become a Carmelite monk. He had not been a monk yet. One reason was that he knew that the Stella Maris Carmelite monastery in Haifa, and he intended to ask to be transferred there after he took his vows. His Zionism drove his choice of monastic order. He was subsequently accepted into the order and named a brother and then Father Daniel because, as Father Joseph said, Rufeisen had been like Daniel in the lion's den and survived. Rufeisen later settles into a monastery in Czerska, about 50 miles from Krakow, and he begins his life as a monk. It was then that he wrote to his brother Aryeh in Palestine, who was living in a moshav near Haifa, to tell him that he was still alive. Very soon after that, Rufeisen requested relocation to Israel from the order of Krakow, and his request was denied. In 1956, with the outbreak of anti-Semitism in Poland and large numbers of Jews married to Poles immigrating to Palestine, Rufeisen saw this as an opportunity and again requested relocation to Israel a second time. This time, his wish was granted and he immediately applied for a Polish visa to enter Israel. Since he was known as somewhat of a troublemaker, his visa request was initially denied. That is by the Israelis. Soon after, by chance, he met a person named Hirsch Smodar, who he had knew from his partisan days in the forest during the war. Smodar was working for the Jewish Historical Institute in Warsaw and was willing to help him. Smodar was a communist of high rank in the party, and he was able to get Rufeisen to see someone at headquarters to help with his visa. Within a few weeks, he had a passport. Upon receipt, he had to resign his Polish citizenship, which, if he was denied entry into Israel, would leave him stateless. He reluctantly did so, and then before his final arrangements could be made, he met with the Israeli ambassador to Poland, Katriel Katz. And there was a short conversation worth recounting. The ambassador asked him, how do you want to go to Israel? As a missionary? As a tourist? I want to go as a Jew, came the answer from Rufeisen. Now, he's a monk dressed in monastic order. But you're a Catholic, a priest, a monk. Being a priest is my vocation, Oswald said. In the end, Katz denied the request for immigration under the law of return and gave Rufeisen a one-year visa. And he said to him, I'll be able to give you a one-year visa, and they will not remove you after a year. Katz was really just kicking the can down the road. In fact, H.M. Shapiro of the National Religious Party and head of the Ministry of the Interior begged Rufeisen to apply for it as a non-Jew and his entry would be permitted. Rufeisen refused. He wanted the state to recognize him as a Jew. The state denied his request. Rufeisen appealed the decision to the Israeli Supreme Court. In a sense, Rufeisen was challenging the entire Zionist enterprise in regards to its claim to have remade Jewishness into a nationality and not a religious community. In the end, the judges, except for Judge Chaim Cohen, could not separate national identity from religion, even as they did so by essentially adjudicating against the halachic definition of a Jew. It's interesting because in that case, the Rabbanut actually came out on the side of Rufeisen, that even though he was an apostate to Christianity, he's still halachically is considered a Jew. Cohen seemed to be the sole voice on the court who was willing to take the revolutionary nature of Zionism to its natural conclusion. In his dissent, he wrote as follows, this is Chaim Cohen's dissent in the case, never before has there been such a revolutionary event in the history of the Jewish people. The revolution is not merely of a political character, it renders imperative a revision of the values which we have imbibed in our long exile, end quote. But Cohen's attempt to convince his colleagues of the Zionist definition of Jewishness, apart from religion, failed. The case was deemed so important that the Prime Minister David Ben-Gurion wrote a letter to a group of 50 Judaic scholars to weigh in on the Rufeisen case. Ben-Gurion's letter seemed to indicate that he wanted to make a sharp distinction between the Jewish community in Israel and in the diaspora. He wrote mostly about mixed marriages and argued that mixed marriages who make aliyah should be fully absorbed into Israeli society, and the commitment to live in Israel was itself a commitment to the Jewish people, sufficient to make label of Jewishness. But there's a interesting personal dimension to Ben-Gurion's argument. Ben-Gurion's son Amos, who fought with the British Army during the war, was injured. He was nursed back to health by a Scottish nurse named Mary, who he fell in love with, and wrote to his parents that he was going to marry. Ben-Gurion, who only wanted both of them to come to live in Israel, he wrote a letter to Joachim Prinz, who was a Berlin Reform rabbi who had escaped the Nazis to America and then was in the UK. Some people know about Joachim Prinz was the person who actually spoke immediately before Martin Luther King at the 1963 memorial. And Prince was also the one who was originally invited to march with King at the 1965 Selma March, and he couldn't do it because of a conflict in his schedule, and I read Joshua Heschel was invited instead. That's really missing an opportunity. So anyway, Prince happened to be in London. He knew Ben-Gurion. Ben-Gurion wrote him a letter. And Ben-Gurion said to Prince that he didn't care at all if Mary converted to Judaism, as long as she lived in Israel. But Ben-Gurion's wife was very adamant that she convert, and Ben-Gurion was conveying her wishes. And so basically, he asked Prince to do a kind of shotgun conversion on the spot in England so that they could come to Israel, she could come to Israel as a Jew. Interestingly, Mary agreed to convert on one condition, that she could retain the name Mary, which she did for the remainder of her life. Amos and Mary, who Ben-Gurion loved as a daughter, made Aliyah, and Mary served in the Palmach during the War of Independence. And years later, she converted with the Orthodox rabbi. So I just say that because there was some kind of personal investment here in Ben-Gurion in this particular case. Ben-Gurion's letter did not achieve the results he wanted. Most of the scholars who responded to Ben-Gurion rejected his idea and argued that Jewishness in the state of Israel should comply with traditional halachic practice. Of course, in this case, it actually doesn't. That is, religious norms should dictate the nature of Israeli citizenship or one's Jewish status. Much has been written about the Brother Daniel case. I don't want to rehearse the legal opinions here, and they're not really directly relevant to the matters. Suffice it to say that Rufeisen, by then known nationally in Israel simply as Brother Daniel, was denied entry to the country under the law of return because Jew, for the purposes of immigration, required not being a member of another religion, even though the court acknowledged that, according to halakha, Rufeisen remained a Jew. Yet, he could not have Jew on his passport or identity card, but was granted citizenship by the rights of righteous Gentiles. The court acknowledged all he had done for the Jewish people, and also his own personal conviction that he remained a Jew. The court decided, as Leo Strauss noted in the beginning, the fundamental conception of Jew and Christian are a contradiction in terms. This hurt Rufeisen deeply, but he accepted the decision, and it did not deter him from his larger goals of making the case for Jewish Christianity. During his life at the Stella Maris Monastery, Rufeisen became part of a group known as the Society of Hebrew Christians in Israel that was founded by Father Elias Friedman, who was a Jewish doctor from South Africa who had converted to Catholicism during World War II and then became a Carmelite monk. Rufeisen also met part of a group of theologians in Israel called the St. James Group. James was one of Jesus' apostles who later founded a Judeo-Christian church, as is known. Rufeisen openly desired to return to a Hebrew church that once existed in the land of Israel. He conducted Mass in Hebrew, and despite the decision of the Supreme Court for the purposes of immigration, he traveled around the country to teach Israeli children about the origins of Christianity, identifying as an Israeli, a Jew, and a Carmelite priest, and spoke about Christianity's deep ties to Judaism. Rufeisen believed that Christianity was part of Judaism, and he gave his life for realigning these religions that history had torn asunder. His lifelong friend Hillel Seidel once said that he thought Rufeisen would eventually return to Judaism. When a journalist asked Rufeisen if what Seidel said was true, Rufeisen replied, "How can I return? I never left." Rufeisen continued his work as a Jew in the church, a Zionist to his last breath. Shmuel Oswald Rufeisen, Brother Daniel, died on July 30th, 1998, and is buried in the Stella Maris Monastery. And his grave is still visited by those who he saved in the Holocaust. Some concluding remarks. What I've tried to argue above is that while certainly dominant, the irreconcilability of Judaism and Christianity was not accepted by all Jews in modernity. The fact that this was the case in antiquity and late antiquity is made by historians who contest the master narrative of the parting of the ways. The complexity and instability of these categories, Judaism, Christianity, and Jew-Christian, hyphen, no hyphen, continued well beyond antiquity up to our time. One could bring many examples aside from apostates, for example, Martin Buber, Shalom Ash, Jacob Taubes, Pinchas Lapid, and all who contested Strauss's zero-sum assessment, which has largely been adopted in the popular imagination articulated in the Boyarin quote. The two examples examined here, Elijah C. Soloveitchik, an ultra-traditional Jew from Belazhin, and Oswald Rufeisen, a Polish Jew converted to Catholicism yet maintained a strong Jewish identity expressed through Zionism, exemplify a different approach to the question of compatibility and categorical difference, that is, negotiating the hyphen. Both suggest something more than simply repossessing a historical Jesus that was common among many other Jews in modernity. Both claim in different ways that the distinction that divides Judaism and Christianity was a matter of degree and not kind, even in regards to many aspects of church theology. Soloveitchik was the more strident of the two on this point. He claimed that some of those regnant categorical distinctions are founded in Christian misunderstandings of the gospel due to their ignorance of Judaism, and Jewish misunderstandings of the gospel due to the fact that Jews are not reading the gospels at all, or at least not reading them Jewish texts that can be illuminated through a rabbinic lens. In this sense, for Soloveitchik, Judaism is the religion for Jews and Christianity for Christians. But any categorical distinction between them is simply the result of textual incompetence. While he never overtly treats the question of conversion, my reading of him suggests that conversion for reasons of conviction would be unnecessary precisely because there's not enough of a difference between one and the other. For Rufeisen, conversion is the center of his entire relationship to Christianity. He exhibited no sympathy for Christianity beforehand, noting he had only negative attitudes towards the church that were largely culturally determined. That is, he didn't even know enough about Christianity to reject it. Unlike Soloveitchik, Rufeisen's relationship to Christianity doesn't emerge from any immersion in Christian texts. When Mother Superior responded to his desire to convert with, "But how can you convert, Oswald? You know nothing about Christianity," she was quite right. But for Rufeisen, what he did know was that Jesus died an unjust death and God resurrected him. This was precisely the Jewish response he was seeking to make sense of the Jewish suffering he witnessed and the hope of collective resurrection in the land of Israel that he hoped for. Jesus' death resembled for him the innocent murder of the Jews, the way Chagall's crucifix paintings did for Chagall. And Jesus' resurrection gave Rufeisen hope that Zionism would be the miraculous redemption, their miracle at Lourdes. The Jews needed from this inexplicable exhibition of pure evil, certainly not making it justifiable, but making it in some way comprehensible. Most Jews today would likely reject both Soloveitchik and Rufeisen for different reasons. Soloveitchik's work, largely ignored, will likely be viewed as a misuse or highly selective use of rabbinic text to interpret an anti-rabbinic corpus. In fact, as we know, the Talmud had some very negative things to say about nascent Christianity, and certainly accelerated in post-rabbinic literature, beginning with Toldot Yeshu that parodied the gospel as full of lies, fantasies, and deceptions. And in today's world, where tolerance has largely replaced coercion, the categorical distinction between Judaism and Christianity is arguably even more necessary. Many Jews will say that Elijah Soloveitchik was being naive, thinking that anti-Semitism was founded on the New Testament, and that a Jewish understanding of those materials would contribute to its erasure. And this is certainly true. Anti-Semitism is a much more complex phenomenon that cannot be reduced to theology or scriptural interpretation. Whether Soloveitchik's work was read by Jews who were then convinced not to convert is impossible to say, as we have no records of the readership of the Hebrew edition, which might have been the one that Jews read. In the end, though, Soloveitchik and Rufeisen are outliers. But it's precisely outliers that often challenge our regnant views of matters that contribute to our understanding of ourselves. I'm not advocating either Soloveitchik or Rufeisen's views, nor am I rejecting them. Each reader will make their own assessment. I do think, however, that both offer compelling and intriguing views on Judaism and Christianity, each constructing the hyphen as a link and not a divide, that are certainly worth considering as we move further into an age of reassessment and renewal. Thank you very much.
Yeah, I think we should take some questions and discussions, and then perhaps after 10 minutes or so, then I think segue into our sort of concluding remarks and assessments. We'll kind of open it up for everyone to participants and people attending the conference for some general comments. So let's first open up discussion on this very interesting, evocative talk. I found it very intriguing that sort of juxtaposing these two very different figures. Let's begin
Well, I have a comment and a question. I'll ask my question first. I guess I'm just so struck by your talk after your question to me last night, because in some sense you asked me, how could these people think that they could go back to some pure tradition? That just makes no sense to me. And I feel like I have to ask that question of you, because in some sense it's impossible going back to some pure text when the tradition is all there as this great obstacle.
Right. No, it's a good question. Yeah, it's a good question. I guess, look, it's kind of interesting in a way. You know, Soloveitchik doesn't necessarily think that he is reconstructing a pure Christianity. When I gave a paper on his commentary to the book of Matthew at a session at the Society for Biblical Literature, which is in this Rufeisen group, so all Matthew scholars, and one of the things that some of them said was, this person is interpreting the New Testament like a 4th century Christian, like the Pseudo-Clementines. In other words, he doesn't know that he's skipping over the whole tradition, but he is, because he's just reading it, as a raw text. So I don't think in Soloveitchik's case, as opposed to Nehir, who claimed like, I'm going to capture this pure religion, I don't think that Soloveitchik thinks he's doing that. Rufeisen, I think, is a different story. I mean, the psychology is complicated. I think it's really, he enters into some kind of fantastical world in the monastery, and he starts to kind of, it becomes this escapist sense of thinking, imagining himself in some first century Jesus movement community. I don't think that he thinks he's bringing it back. I just think he just transposes himself as a result of the anxiety. So I guess I'm less sympathetic to Nehir because as an intellectual, in a certain way, he should know better. No, exactly.
Okay, but I just make my comment
Yeah.
too, because I guess the other thing that strikes me is that it's really interesting to think about Rufeisen along with Levinas, because one of the things that I am more and more struck by the more I go back to Levinas' writings from during the war in particular and before the war is that he really does have a theology of the Jews as the suffering servant, except for him, it's exactly the sense in which there's certainly no resurrection at the end of it. In some sense, the Jews are the purer version of Christ, by virtue of the fact that their tragedy and the love of God is in pure suffering. So there is a kind of happy fairy tale ending that Rufeisen is hoping for, that like Levinas thinks the only way in which you can make this transposition is by giving up on
Right,
that.
that's great. Yeah, thank you.
Maybe you could tell the story of how you found the translation, the 85.
Basically, I mean, there's a long story about how this happened in general. I'll tell very briefly. I was sitting in my office one day working at home, and I get an email from a friend. There's no hello Shaul. There's just, have you ever heard of Elias Soloveitchik? And I said no. And then he sends me a PDF of a small Hebrew book that was written by a guy named Dov Hyman, who was a podiatrist in New York City, who happened to be at the main Jerusalem synagogue, Heichel Shlomo, for services, and he was rummaging around in the bookshelves, and he found a copy of Soloveitchik's the 1985 Hebrew, reissued Hebrew translation, commentary to Matthew. And he had never heard of this person, but because Soloveitchik was was a kind of rabbinic dynastic name, he begins to do all of this research, and he finds some of this material. So he writes this pamphlet, he publishes it privately, he only publishes 50 copies. So this person had one of the copies. He sent me a copy, and I start reading it, and then I said, this is fascinating stuff. And so I'm poking around the internet. I don't remember even how I was doing it, but I end up getting an email. I must have put a request on social media or something like that. I end up getting an email from a minister in Arizona, and he says, oh yeah, I have 2 copies of the 1985 Hebrew, And I said, well, would you mind selling me one? He said, no, I'm going to send it to you for free. I'm going to pay for the postage. And so he basically sent me this 1985 copy, and then we were able to hunt down the original 1860, because in the book, the Bible, the Bible, the Talmud, and the New Testament, which is a translation and an annotated commentary to his commentary on Mark and Matthew, I wanted to use the first edition, and then we were able to find that this is the first edition that we were able to find in the Bible. So that's that. I've completely forgotten the name of who this person is, but he kind of has brought this Soloveitchik back to life.
So I found this talk really interesting. So I think you brought us back full circle in a way, because yesterday I talked about problems of boundary definition and identity that spring from mutual identification, and you brought us back to that in a really new and different, interesting way. But my question is about just how mutual the identification is. So on the one hand, I agree with your interpretation that in a way, Brother Daniel, this is really hard for the Israeli state and for Jews to accept, precisely for the reasons that I think Leora Padnitsky sort of underscores in her book on how Judaism became religion, that the national, ethnic, cultural, religious elements have been pulled apart in the modern age, but that's not so easy to do in the Jewish case. And so that's what I think creates that resistance to recognizing his claims on the Jewish side. But then my question has to do with the attitude of the church toward his claims. So in principle, it should be much easier for the church to accept his claims because Christianity is, by its own self-understanding, it's a denationalized, de-ethnicized religion. That's its universalistic aspect. But on the other hand, we also know from David Nierenberg's book and other work about this sort of fear of Judaizing in the Christian tradition. So I'm curious what the church's reaction to Brother Dano's claims were, whether they were sort of fine with all this and said, yeah, it makes sense to us, or whether they also said, no, you can't be both, you have to choose, it's one of the...
Right, that's a good question. I could just say from things that he said, and I remember living in Israel in the 80s, I remember we knew of him. I mean, it was a kind of a place to go and visit him. He said that when he first came to Stella Maris, he was marginalized by most of the other monks. He and also his friend Friedman, who was the South African doctor who had converted. Although Friedman comes to Israel not under the law of return, Friedman comes to Israel as under the law of righteous Gentiles, or whatever it's called. So Friedman wasn't that, he wasn't that interested in identifying as a Jew. Although I think that he did. So Rufeisen said that two things happened. First of all, he became marginalized because of precisely this question, his Jewish identity. And then he became marginalized because he was bringing too much attention to the monastery. I mean, these were monks after all, right? That they became monks not to become celebrities. So the fact that the monastery was full of visitors all the time was something that they didn't appreciate. So he eventually started to leave the monastery more and more and spent a lot of time traveling around the country. But I think he does say, I don't know about the church formally, but certainly the monks in the monastery thought he was a bit of a problematic figure.
Did he, thank you very much for your talk, did he engage at some point with Einstein?
I don't know.
This man who, who was...
I don't know, but there is a correspondence that I read between him and Rufeisen, Cardinal Rufeisen. Right. Cardinal Rufeisen was a bishop in Paris who was a Jew, who openly identified as a Jew, and when he died, one of the last things that he requested was to have Kaddish recited at his funeral. So the funeral was done at Notre Dame, which is where the funeral church was. And then his brother, and then the chief rabbi of Paris convened a minyan in the plaza outside the church, and Rufeisen's brother recited Kaddish for him. So there's an interesting correspondence between the two of them that's actually worth examining a little bit more closely. They had different views on things, but they were both people who continued to identify as Jews, even though they were Christians. But in terms of Edith Stein, I don't know.
Yeah, it's something that puzzles me. That Jesus was a Jew. His apostles were all Jews. The New Testament was written by Jews, and they never said anything about starting a new religion. So I don't see why it would be that difficult for Christians to convert to Judaism.
Well, I mean that everything you're saying is true, and then it's Paul's evangelizing the Gentiles and the whole history of Christian. This notion that was created in the 19th century of the parting of the ways between Judaism and Christianity, when that exactly happens. And I mean, they obviously you're saying there were Jewish Christian communities that we know of into the 4th and 5th centuries. I mean, the Pseudo-Clementine homilies seem clearly written by a Jewish community. So the Jewish church continued to exist long after Paul. But it began to diminish and then get swallowed up into the larger church. And then, the kind of anti-Jewish sentiment that emerges in the church that you can say maybe has its origins in the Gospel of John, but the Gospel of John was probably written by Jews. So it comes up later on for a variety of reasons having to do with supersessionism and the theology of supersessionism and the doctrinal positions of supersessionism, that Judaism simply is no longer viable after Christianity. Christianity simply replaces it. So then you have 1,000 or 1,500 years of that history. So then when you come around into modernity, it's a little bit more complicated to go back to the beginning, the way that Rufeisen wanted to.
Yeah. Am I right to think that it's a very different trajectory intellectually than Paulinism? Because in Paul, there is, with supersessionism, there is also an overcoming of this Jew with the flesh, right? Which you don't have, if I understand you well, with Rufeisen.
Right.
So it's a very strange and quite unique intellectual configuration and religious configuration, where you have on the one hand Judaism understood as an ethnicity or heritage, whatever you want to call that, and on the other hand there is this almost an affirmation of a more authentic way of accomplishing one's Judaism and Christianity, which recalls Paulinism. Would you agree?
To some degree, although this gets into, like, I mean, I'm not a New Testament scholar, but this gets into an entire debate among New Testament scholars about what was Paul's real relationship to Judaism and whether he really thought, forgetting about the way it's interpreted later on, but there's certainly an argument to be made that that Paul did not intend to erase the Judaism of the flesh. And there was an open letter by Michael Wishelgrad written to Cardinal Luchtazé, when Cardinal Luchtazé basically made this claim in an interview in the 1980s that he believes that his Christianity is a fulfillment of his Jewishness, or of the Judaism. And so Michael Wishelgrad writes him a letter and says, on your own terms, and maybe even on Paul's terms, if what you're saying is true, you still are commanded in the mitzvot. In other words, you have to, if you say that your Christianity is a fulfillment of your Judaism, then you are still commanded, and there is a reading of Paul that can basically justify that particular claim. So again, that enters into an entire other, which I'm not competent to enter. Yes. Yes.
Let's maybe we'll have one more
Sure.
question about your presentation. Then I'd like to move directly into a kind of thinking about